Thank you so much, Happy. And first of all, thanks a lot to CMS and you to have me speak today. I think the topic is healthcare content marketing post-pandemic. But what I'll do is I'll probably start talking a little bit about content marketing itself in healthcare. And when I say healthcare, I'll be speaking more from medical devices lens. And healthcare is very broad. It can be hospitals, it can be providers, policymakers, and many other stakeholders. So let me just walk through that, and through the sessions I've seen, this is not new. Many other speakers have talked about the framework of a buyer's journey, but in healthcare, the interesting bit is when we talk about awareness, there are so many stakeholders, and it's not like stakeholders in B2B. It's not uncommon that in B2B you have multiple stakeholders, but in healthcare, what happens is that we end up with the consumption is very different from who the decision maker, influencer, advocacy, the policymakers regulate, and we can't bring a new product unless we have the registrations. Reimbursement insurance plays a big part. Hospitals may want a certain capital equipment that the doctors may not want to use. And if we have the doctors onboarded, then the hospitals might not want to pay for it. And at the end of all of this, the patients may never want to see the doctor. So the point when we create awareness, our goal is to find a key sponsor, somebody who will go out on the limb to make sure that this technology comes to the ecosystem. And that's where the goal of the awareness creation ends up to be. When we talk about consideration, because of the risk and the liability that's involved, it needs extremely high level of validation, and the consideration requires both evidence, which is either economic or clinical, or and actually it requires very high amount of advocacy. So advocacy is not an afterthought; it is absolutely part of our plans, and it is very essential to our buyer's journey. And decision making, again, it's a very involved process, and not only is the stakeholders in the hospital, but interestingly our channel partners, our distributors, play an important role because they're so close to the hospitals that even we don't know how that influencing sometimes works, and we need to work through that process. So the point I was going to make here is that buyer's journey in healthcare is more like an ecosystems journey in healthcare. So you have to orient your mind that there is no buyer there. It's very difficult to create personas and say we're going to move one persona all the way to decision, and the content has to play a role in that ecosystem. And the point I would make around the content is that in awareness, our primary goal is around education, and there are multiple ways of doing it. When we talk about consideration, we invest a lot of money in generating evidence and advocacy, but that nurturing of interest to move the lead forward or to move the ecosystem forward is through a lot of that technical information, which is very intense in numbers and terminologies, and storytelling becomes very difficult because of that. And the third piece, which is decision making, tends to be, like I said, involved because now you need to train people on how to use the technology. It's hands-on. It is something which is done face-to-face. It needs some sort of in-person involvement in many of those cases, and content has played a role there. So that sort of broadly paints a picture on what content marketing or content, how content plays a role. But then let's see what happened during pandemic. And again, looking at that framework, there is a part of it which we were starting to use more digital interaction. And it's not to say that we were doing a great job in medical devices. And I would say we are still in early days of understanding how to leverage the power of content socially. But that it was taking shape. But as you move towards the decision phase, it's very in person, and the leads become and the implementation and the training becomes more and more involved in person. But that completely broke down as pandemic hit us. So when that broke down, we had to think creatively, and we created new engagement options where demos can be done virtually. We created videos, we created Zoom-based interactions, we created a lot of in-servicing videos and in-servicing content, which was in a way done by the same team, which would do it in person, but done it virtually wherever possible. At the same time, what we realized was that the decision making is getting delayed. At least 2020, it was a difficult year for hospitals to make a lot of new acquisitions, but they were also at the same time making acquisitions of essential products and essential technologies. So it was critical for us to scale up and generate more and more awareness to position our brand. And there couldn't be a better year for us to have in terms of think about investing on the side of awareness and considerations in the funnel. So we increased our number of educational posts. We did a lot of summaries and white papers, multiple webinars, a lot of distribution of our mailers, the content that we used to struggle to convince people to take out or distribute within their networks was very readily accepted and needed. And we also improved lead sourcing and management, scoring and management, sorry. And I think that lead scoring management tended to be so offline that we have become more and more intelligent through this year on how we manage that process. So what I would say is that the pandemic sort of shifted us to become end-to-end digital, which I think we probably accelerated the entire, I believe the industry has moved 10 years ahead during the pandemic time because of all this, the gap in the in-person interaction possibility. Now, coming to the topic of post-pandemic, what will it look like? And I'll just share my thoughts. And it is, of course, with you can take it with as much salt as you want to. But the first is, we are an industry which is extremely dependent on relationships, to the extent that probably startups coming in medical devices, medtech, they probably the question in their mind would be, how do we go out and sell a product? And you end up looking for channel partners or distributors who take hefty margins to take your product to the hospital. So relationships used to define everything. And interpersonal, the point I'm trying to make is, interpersonal relationship was key to purchase decision making, and FaceTime was required. It's not even something that was, I mean, there is a kind of an underlying expectation that you're going to come meet me, build time, spend time with us, and then something will move. But what we have noticed is, and what I believe moving forward, the pandemic will do it, is digital engagements with the brand and the content will need to fill a void. The void of in-person interactions will not be existent. And I wouldn't say not existent, to put a caveat there. I think training and in surgery support and many of those skills which are required will still have to be done in person. But anything around awareness, consideration, all the way till late stages of decision, I think we would probably see a shift, and we're already seeing that shift. That I think the brand will have to bear the burden, and a lot of content will have to be customized and personalized. And many of the speakers have talked about it, but it's extremely essential for healthcare moving forward to think like that. The second point I would make is around the content experience. Now, because the content used to be mostly words, pictures, sound, videos, and we try to capture all our technical content within that framework. But if there is not going to be an in-person engagement, or there's going to be reduced in-person engagement, the content will have to become more immersive. Of course, AR and VR is coming up, and it's going to become more mainstream, in my opinion. But I think there are going to be more interesting ways in which technology will fill that gap. It has to become as close to the in-person interaction that the stakeholders were used to before pandemic, to really feel comfortable, and I think it is bound to happen. Another point I think is important is that the ecosystem that I talked about, there is information shared within the ecosystem. Now, doctors talk to the patients, the hospitals are talking to their physicians, the policymakers are constantly talking to the hospitals around reimbursement and procedure and all that. And we don't have access to that. In fact, we restricted by law, or is it just not visible to us? But what will happen post pandemic is that content will become shared, or will probably get shared by them. It will get adapted, it'll get tweaked or whatever. But most important is, stakeholders in the ecosystem are going to look for credible sources of content. And it is going to be it's going to be an essential criteria. And at a certain point, I probably think that we are already very regulated. Our content goes through intensive copy approval process. But I think it's going to become even more structured from the regulators on how content is coming out. And I think that is something we should think about, on how our content can be adapted and shared within the ecosystem, and where is it really going after, if it once it comes out of our boxes. And last point that was in my mind around post-pandemic, what might it look like, is that the ability to reduce social contact. It'll become part of messaging, and I don't mean to say that it's a good thing. And actually, I don't know it's a good thing or a bad thing. But the point is that physical separation as a value proposition was never a human unmet need. And we talk a lot about unmet need from a clinical standpoint, but as a human unmet need, that was never there. But having said that, we will have to figure out how to associate that in our value props, in our messaging, without necessarily keeping I mean, we have to keep the humanity intact. We have to keep the emotion intact. But from a tactical or from a very functional standpoint, it allows for people not to touch each other or interact with each other. And I think medical technology will, medical devices, both the product development and messaging, will have more and more messaging around that aspect. Probably other industries also would be thinking about it as we speak. So with that, maybe I thought I'll try to also share some of the things that we did which help and which have we have gotten some validation around tactically when you're thinking about content in healthcare. When you're doing awareness, select content which is really worthy of sharing. And there, many other speakers have talked about it. Is it what is in it for me? Just now, Tani was talking about it as well. It should not be promotional, because we are talking about a broad spectrum of stakeholders, and we don't know how they associate to it at that stage of awareness at the top of the funnel. It should not be biased. Unfortunately, in clinical setting, they can always be two opinions, and it's very difficult to put out content without somebody else challenging that content. But having said that, you have to figure out a way of taking out content which is not biased by the organization and is backed by extremely credible sources like societies, like guidelines, things which cannot be refuted. And that's going to be essential to be recognized as a credible source of information. Second is less is definitely more. And I don't mean to say in terms of frequency of putting out content, I mean the piece itself. Our content can be almost like a book, and it can be like so much technical information, graphs, numbers, but it's an art and science to make it less and make it engaging and to make it visual. And it's something that that kind of a capability has to be built in-house or with your agencies, but it's absolutely essential. Leverage networks within your organization. Now, while in-person interaction has gone down, over the last many years of this industry, relationships have been built, and it would be a shame to lose all of that. So we have started scanning business cards from our reps. We try to reach out to the networks of our team members who know whoever they know within their networks, within the compliance of how we reach to people. But you have to leverage your existing physical networks while you would also mine leads online. And finally, and I have to emphasize this, content marketing in healthcare cannot be done without the internal stakeholders' approval. It just is not possible. And if there is no one, there are like 3 or 4 or 5 people sometime who get involved, legal, compliance, and everybody who will have a view on what you can say and what you cannot. So having them engaged, involved, and constantly updated on what you're thinking, how you're moving about it, is critical to your calendar. Execution will never happen otherwise. So with that, I mean, to quickly wrap this up, is that there is a lot of content with us, and I think content marketing probably is a conversation which has become very, very exciting and hot. But in healthcare, that's all we always have had. We have had a tremendous amount of content, but all that content, the way it was getting distributed was very much in person. Today, that has changed, and it's changing. So I believe it's a golden era for content marketing in healthcare. And I think it is, while the foundation on which this era is starting is really not the best time. Pandemic is not the best thing that could have happened to us. Actually pretty bad. But it is for content marketing and for the evolution of content marketing in healthcare, it is the right time.